Interesting, and I thought that I would share that.
Their message for humanity is that, and it's the tenet of many religions, is that we need to become more loving, we need to become forgiving of ourselves and forgiving of others, thus stopping the wheel of karma. We need to focus on becoming more service to others on a daily basis. And we need to focus on raising our vibration and our consciousness.
Well, first of all, I want to thank the organizers for inviting me. It's beautiful here. Beautiful. How do you qualify as a whistleblower? The definition is a person who informs on a person or an organization that is engaged in illicit activity. People feel from their conscience they need to come forward. So there are a lot of laws that are put in place to keep secrets. Most of these unacknowledged programs are illegal by their very definition. So those who've been ordered to keep silent are breaking the law. They're not upholding the law. Now, in most cases, for a whistleblower, you're going to need documentation, supporting physical evidence, and testimony. Testimony is, you can enter testimony as evidence in a court of law. So testimony has to be backed up with supporting evidence and the proper documentation, which is hard to obtain with civilian assets, but military assets, you have their processing papers, their DD-214. Compartmentalization, it has been used to a major degree to prevent people within the same organization from having access to the same information. There can be, usually everyone is told they're at the top of the totem pole with intelligence. And each one of these people, they believe it so strongly, if you come with information that's above what they have been told they are, they will disbelieve it because their egos believe that they have the highest information in the land. And of course, testimony, because the way compartmentalization works, you can be shown very sensitive papers, photos, videos, but it's done in what is called a skiff room. It is a room that is, it blocks all signals from technology from coming in, and the information cannot leave that skiff room. So therefore, it is impossible for these documents to make it out to the public. So how does my story begin? How many people here have watched Cosmic Disclosure? Okay. Well, if you go to blueavians.com, you can watch some free episodes for those who have not seen it, and it is translated into Spanish. I used to think that my involvement in the programs began just from some testing that I did, and I popped up on their radar. But it turns out that my family is a part of a multi-generational experiment that began in World War II. My grandfather was a Seventh-day Adventist, which is a non-violent, very non-violent sect of Christianity. And he was drafted into the military, but because of his religious beliefs, they gave him a choice to join a program to where he wouldn't have to engage in combat. And that program was similar, but not Project White Coat. It was very similar. They would inject them with viruses and bacteria that were commonly found on the battlefield, and then they would develop treatments for it. That was the cover story. What was actually occurring is that in 1945, before we had supposedly discovered DNA, they were already manipulating DNA using viruses as a delivery system. And I'm a product of that experiment. Growing up, it was never a big secret that my grandfather was a part of an experiment. We were told never ask him about it. He was very upset. He was a very proud, vain man. And when he was given the injections, he became so ill that while they were taking care of him, they put a bunch of pillows behind his back, and his back fused in a curved manner. And he was like this ever since I was born. That's how I knew him, and he was a very proud man. Recently, Dr. Sala and some of his associates submitted a Freedom of Information Act. I was told not to say FOIA because it might get an interesting reaction from the Spanish speakers. But the Freedom of Information Act, it didn't give us the information we wanted, and the medical information about my grandfather only went back to, I believe, 1984. So there was a huge gap. Now, of course, America has a huge history of unsuspecting tests on its citizens and soldiers. The Tuskegee airmen, they were giving them syphilis on purpose. And finally, there was an apology, but, this just goes to show the level of governments, and it's not just the American government, that you'd think they would test on an enemy population, but they test on their own population. Now, I was brought into the MyLab program, which stands for Military Abduction, and this is a program that identifies children that have certain gifts, and then usually these people identify as starseeds, as I'm sure all of you do. What the military's goal was to find these starseeds before they engaged in their mission and to turn them to the dark side, so to speak, and to use them as a tool. And this is done at a level that's very sickening. And of course, they use both civilian and military assets. They mostly use military assets in the 20 and back programs. Rarely do they use civilians. Yeah, there's a picture of me. I think I was 7 there. So they developed standardized testing to be able to identify a number of different things that they're looking for the programs. One of them was they were looking for intuitive empaths to help them interface with non-humans. Usually they already had a good idea who these empaths were because they track every alien abduction that occurs. Almost every abduction that occurs, the military comes in, re-abducts them, goes through, they do a debriefing with them, usually under chemical means, pharmaceuticals. Then they give them more screen memories, which really confuses them after they've already had that done by the non-terrestrials. And then they return them back to back home. They gather intelligence after they're abducted. And this is done on a wide scale in almost every country. Now, in the beginning, they used a lot of children, a lot of military assets in these programs, but later on in the most recent years, they've started using clones. They grow clones, and then they become programmed life forms. They are not as efficient as an Earth-grown human, though. Efficient in doing these different jobs, like interfacing with aliens. They don't have the experiences that we have on Earth to add to the communication, which is very important. About an hour from where I grew up, there was a base called Carswell Air Force Base. It was I think it was the 7th Bomber Wing. Now, after they identified me in school, as being an asset, they found a way to pull me out of normal classes into different classes. Sometimes I would be in classes with extremely gifted people, and sometimes I'd be in classes with people that were wearing diapers. I mean, they were people that were underdeveloped, but they just wanted me out of the mainstream curriculum so that they could remove me from school at any point. Under Carswell Air Force Base, during, of course, the Cold War, everyone thought nuclear war was going to happen. They built a huge underground facility. That underground facility connects to the underground magnetic train system, the maglev system. And recently, there are two different people I've described where I went in, which I went in the back gate. I crossed 2 airstrips, went through another checkpoint, and then drove into a large motor pool hangar that was kind of like an airplane hangar with the doors opened. And I would go in, and there'd be windows on the 2nd floor overlooking where all the vehicles park. Their program is to basically, like Noah's Ark, keep the human genome safe from extinction by keeping part of it underground and part of the human race on other planets. So we don't have all of our eggs in one basket, as I say, in Texas anyway. So there's a lot of cloning that goes on. That's been going on for a long time. Anything that is unethical on the surface to do, research-wise, is either going on in Antarctica, in their R&D bases, or below ground. A major area is in Mexico, the Zone of Silence. They have, originally they called it an NBC facility, nuclear biological chemical development, but they do quite a lot of cloning there, and very disturbing experiments. This is, you've probably seen this on the internet. This is very old and somewhat accurate of the maglev or magnetic trains that go underground. They go to all these different bases, and it shows it going off to down to Central and South America. But I haven't seen any maps that show the details of South America. That goes through a lot through Brazil, Argentina. So a lot of the training that we had when we were taken underground, we were interfacing with technologies that there would be like plates that you put your hand on, or 2 little protrusions in a chair that connect to, the dimples in the back of your shoulders. That's an area where a lot of nerves crisscross. And that is a place to where if they have this node, this metal node, positive, negative, going that you lay back against, and also plates that you can put your hands on, it is a neurological interface to technology. The things you see out of your eyes, you completely believe. You hear, you smell, you taste. They can manipulate all of that. One of the major tests is for you to be able to determine when you've been put into some sort of a virtual reality simulation. They're so real, it's very difficult. And of course, back then, at the end of every session, you were chemically blank slated, which means mind erased and given screen memories. If you left school, your memories would be that you went to a natural history museum and looked at dinosaur bones, when in actuality, you had gone underground and had been subjected to all kinds of terrible experiments. You come home and you have all this trauma from what? Seeing dinosaur bones? So it was hard to explain the trauma that we would have and the bad dreams. We usually trained in small cells, and between the ages of 6 and 10, normally we were trained at night. We were picked up and we were brought to a mall, an indoor mall where you normally go shopping. It would be shut down, and there would be reptilians there. There would be different groups there that would be observing the training that would go on, and different cells of children would be pitted against each other in these competitions. So they had to start somewhere with the children, so they started with a lot of the basic training. We learned traditional firearms, field stripping of weapons, blindfolded, by touch. We learned hand-to-hand combat, which was something I was already learning from my grandfather. Wayfinding, reading maps and being able to determine where you are and how to get to where you want to be. Calculating objects at a distance for, kind of like snipers do, the rule of thumb type of, to tell how far away a human is. And of course, communication protocols for radio. Now, you cannot just introduce a person to a non-terrestrial without some sort of acclimation or preparation. In the beginning, the virtual reality scenarios I was mentioning, we would walk into a room and there would be like card tables, like you play cards at, with military and scientific people sitting around them. And then you would go into your virtual reality training. And then when you would come out, and as they were walking you back through where you came, you would look over at the table and there would be a gray alien sitting there. And that was their first little step. Usually they will show you photos to kind of get your mind ready for it, and then they introduce you to these beings in that kind of a manner. They don't want it to be too much of a shock. And if you asked any questions like, what was that? Right, they would just tell you you didn't have a need to know. So this helped deprogram the fight or flight response that all of us have. It can be quite the adrenaline release when you're in front of one of these beings, especially as psychic as some of them are. Some of them are very invasive. And of course, there were hybrid children that were present also during our training. And I have a few disturbing stories about my interactions with them that I do not make public. So once they develop you have the intuitive empath abilities, they have a cocktail of chemicals that can enhance those abilities. And when you come off of the chemicals, it is almost like going blind. You lose all of these extra senses. All of your senses are enhanced. But when you're taken off the medication, it's like going blind and deaf to a certain degree. And of course, they believe all evolution occurs through trauma. So much of the training is extremely traumatic, very traumatic. They would put us in sensory deprivation chambers for hours, or you lose all sense of time. It seemed like hours. And even in these sensory deprivation chambers, at times they would use virtual reality as well. And the out-of-body experiences that we had were just epic. Now, a lot of people have heard of the MK Ultra programs, and they associate any type of program like the one that I've been in as being MK Ultra, mind-controlled, German mind-controlled. But there are a lot of Ultra programs, and most of them use the mind control tactics that they learned in MK Ultra, but these other programs have completely other agendas and are only related to MK Ultra by name, the Ultra part. Now, every single person in this room, including myself, is actively under mind control. We have all types of mind controls: socially programmed, religious programmed, genetically programmed, and technology that's interfering with our consciousness. Well, first of all, one of the number one symptoms that children and young teens had, a lot of them would have a very nice life at home, a very good home life with their family, but they had unexplained post-traumatic stress disorder. They couldn't explain it. Well, on one level, of course, our subconscious level, we recall all of the trauma-based programming that occurred, but consciously, there's no memory of it. So there's a conflict between the conscious and the subconscious that creates all of the symptoms of PTSD. I was actually 15 here, I think, but At the age of 13 is when we reached the apex of the training. That's when they started giving us the injections. And the full dose, when they built up to the full dose, the jump in your abilities was so dramatic that a lot of people began to get kind of Christ complexes. Felt like they were something, bigger or better than everyone else. So that was a problem. There were a lot of people that really began to think that they were here to save the planet. I was brought to a crystal cavern, much like the one they found in Mexico. We were brought there in a small submarine that went through an underground river. And the underground river, at a certain point, it diverted into this further area we traveled under, and then we popped out into an area to where there were no crystals. It was a cavern, but we were brought back by the people who were stationed there into this room to where we prepared. We were put in environmental protective suits. We had all of these different devices on us monitoring our telemetry, heart, brain, neurology. And recently, when I was recounting the story, I recalled a blocked memory of a tall white being in the middle of all of the children that were in a circle. These crystals, they told us, were alive. They were beings. They had a life force. They wanted us to interface with them and to gather information, but we were told, do not touch them. If you touch them, you can harm the crystal, and the crystal could harm us. And when we started to interface with them, an aura of light started to build around the crystals. And the crystals were huge, even wider than these. It's very hot, 120 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, USB device, us children, we were used like a USB device. We went in, we interfaced with the crystals, we gathered all of this information, and then we were debriefed chemically, where they removed all the information, just like we were a common memory stick, and then blank slated us. And then that's how they gathered their intelligence. When I was around 13 years old, and I had reached a certain level of ability to interface with non-terrestrials, they brought me and 2 other children to a Federation meeting. This is a very close representation to what that base looked like. It was in the middle of a temporal anomaly outside of Jupiter. You had to enter in and exit the exact same way, or you would get stuck. You could see no stars. You would fly, you'd leave a star field, you would enter this anomaly, and it was pitch black. And there were over 60 different non-terrestrial groups that met in a large portion. It was much like the UN, very much. There would be 1 to 3 ETs sitting in seats, and then there was a horseshoe type rail in front of them, and then they would have psychic support, intuitive empaths of their own, who would sit there and monitor the room, looking for any signs of deception or danger. And when we were sitting there, they did not want us focusing on what was going on. They would give us kind of like iPads, a smart glass pad that you neurologically interfaced with, to have us preoccupy our minds while we were doing the intuitive work. And there was no visible technology in these places. It was all consciousness-based, very advanced technology. Now, attendees included the Nordic races, the Greys, and most of the Greys are a programmed life form. You have positive, negative, and indifferent groups that all use these programmed life forms that we call the Greys. They were developed by an insectoid race way before humans were even on the planet, and it's become like a standard hardware for different beings to use, a biological machine. Now, the reason they had 3 intuitive empaths was that if one picked up on a possible issue, they needed the 2 others to triangulate, to verify that it was a threat, because you would get a lot of false positives at times based on your own emotions of being in a situation. And of course, our different belief systems played into and filtered the information that was coming through, so it was always good to have 3 different perspectives. Normally, the 3 people would not be from the same culture or speak the same languages, and it helped them get a better triangulation. Now, a lot of the information, and one of the biggest problems we have in science is that they focus on the numbers and the tangible, and they do not consider the esoteric like we do. During World War II, the Germans did not have that problem. They married science and the esoteric, and the results were phenomenal. In the early 30s, they were flying around in anti-gravity devices. From the glass pads, all of these different esoteric negative groups had a different belief system or religion about what was to occur in what we're calling the ascension. And they had completely differing ideas on consciousness and how it was developing. So in these negative Illuminati groups, there's not a consensus on their belief systems. There are various belief systems, some very pragmatic, very scientific, some very esoteric, and very just even more out there than people call us. Now, there was an ancient builder race that was here 2 billion years ago in our solar system. And our local star cluster of 52 stars, they had developed out all of those star systems and put a protective grid around it to keep out what we've referred to as the genetic farmer races that come in and start doing all of these different experiments. And they kept the local 52 stars very safe for many, many, many millennia, even over 1 billion years. But the pre-Adamites on Mars and Tiamat had a civil war, and they utilized the technology of this protective grid against each other, and they accidentally brought down the entire grid. And when they did that, all of these genetic farmer races that had really wanted to come in and get this fresh genetic stock, they moved in and took over. This is our local star cluster. You'll see Sol, the sun, right there in the middle. A very coveted position. Just outside of our solar system is what they call a supergate. We've heard portals described here, and those are point-to-point transfers. A supergate can transfer you to any planet within this galaxy and to any galaxy. They're all connected with an electromagnetic filament that we call the cosmic web. Now, when these genetic farmer groups moved in, they started over 22 different genetic experiments here. And these experiments are not just genetic. They're about ascension. And all of them have different agendas for ascension. All of these different groups, these programs compete. And they are a spiritual and genetic ascension program. A lot of these groups, they've brought us religions, different belief systems to help our consciousness expand. And they will tinker with our genetics to cause us to advance genetically. And then this vessel is better able to support the consciousness that they're trying to expand. So these two go together. 65 million years ago, according to the reptilians, this planet was theirs. They believed it was theirs. They had an experiment, a genetic experiment. There's just not only a mammalian experiment going out there on different stars. There are insectoid experiments. There are reptilian. You name it. And the reptilians supposedly had 3 races of humanoids here on Earth that were destroyed in the cleansing, genetic cleansing that occurred by these more human-like ET races that came in. They cleaned the Earth of the reptilian experiment and started a mammalian experiment, which is highly against cosmic law on 1 degree. But they began to do this because the reptilian experiments were just going crazy. There were just too many of them. The reptilians often discuss that there were 3 lost races. Interestingly enough, on Gaia TV, they discovered this 3-fingered mummy in Nazca. Have you all heard of that? Well, I've seen some of the information on the genetic test results. Now, if we were to find an ET body and test it, would any of you be surprised that 97% of that DNA matches ours? It's not because they're from here, it's because we're from there. We've been genetically engineered and spliced with all of these different beings' DNA as a part of this experiment. Now, all of you have heard about the Hopi stories, about how the ant people took humans down into inner Earth during the last cataclysm and then brought them back out afterwards. Well, apparently the reptilians did the same thing. They removed certain species from the surface and brought them underground. They developed into the raptor race, and there are some of them that are like little dogs. There are many different types of species of them. And they're primarily in South and Central America. They are they have on the back of their heads, they have a plume of colorful feathers, and they're kind of a mix between reptilians and birds, and they have real jerky movements like a bird. You know, their heads just real jerky, nothing smooth, and they've been seen quite a bit coming out in Central South America at night to hunt, and they are carnivorous. Millennia ago, they took over a lot of these crystal caves that I had discussed because of the importance it is to this mammalian group of genetic farmers. The 22 genetic experiments. And of course, the insectoids are extremely involved. Most of the technology of the insectoids is not what we would call technology. They will genetically build ships, genetically build drones and workers to do their bidding. And they use that type of technology more than they do what we consider technology. And of course, our local star cluster serves as a host to these programs. And I already mentioned most of this, that these programs are in competition with each other. And they terraform, they bring different plants and animals from different planets, slightly modify them genetically for the new environments. So the programs are made up of these components. There's a genetic component, which I described, where they tinker with our DNA to evolve us a few percent every 5,000 years. The consciousness component and the spiritual component are pretty related, but they need our consciousness to grow at the same time that they're advancing our genetics. Now, of course, some of the competing programs are trying to suppress our consciousness and to interfere with the genetic program. And of course, the cosmic component is the most important. It's like a giant clock. They travel around from planet to planet as our solar system is rotating around the galaxy, going like this around the galaxy. And every once in a while, we come through this one highly energetic, like gaseous part of the of the universe as we go through. And there was a cluster of stars that exploded there and changed the energetics. So, and that is where a lot of these cosmic energies, where we travel through them, and our solar system is revolving, and it's like a dynamo. As it goes through these energies, it's friction. The friction is building up the energy. The energy goes around up into the north and south pole of the sun and comes out from the sun. That's how the sun actually works. It's like a light bulb. Now, I think we're supposed to be in solar minimum, but we've seen some very interesting activity with the sun recently, have we not? And all of that is tied to the energetic weather that is occurring and the earthquakes. These are all things that the Blue Avians told me that were going to happen, and I discussed 6 months ago in Cosmic Disclosure. And now we're watching it happen before us. We understand the concept of star seeds, ET souls incarnating here. Now, what's very bizarre is that a lot of people, they think this group of people is being abducted by non-terrestrials. Isn't that against cosmic law? Isn't that against their free will? Yes, it is. A way around this, the benevolent and malevolent, good and bad, non-terrestrial races are very good at skirting or getting around these cosmic laws. And one of the ways they do that is they will incarnate here as us, forget who and what they are, and then agree to be a part of these experiments. I was first brought into the programs. I was involved in what they called the Intruder, Intercept, and Interrogation program. From our perspective, there was one group that had come in and abducted humans and returned them back to their previous location dead. And our military forces were like, these are evil beings, we need to find out what's going on. And eventually they were able to capture some of them. And it turned out, good and bad is perspective. These beings, thousands of years ago, had a crew that crashed on our planet. And the beings in that ship got caught up in our incarnation cycle. So it was a rescue mission. And from their point of view, it was a rescue mission. From our point of view, humans were being killed. So how do we bridge that gap? That's very, very difficult if you think about it. And of course, it's the natural law loophole that they use by reincarnating here as humans. Now, because these 22 genetic programs are in competition, often they will abduct the experiments of another group to gather intel or to also try to pollute or to mess up the experiment of the opposing group. Now, how is the experiment contained? Well, we are the zookeepers of our own. We're our own prison keepers. They program us through speaking different languages to keep us separate. Different races were programmed through religions, social conditioning, not to interbreed with each other. It goes way back. Many remember in the Bible, the Israelis were told to go in and kill everybody from the opposing races. Well, this goes back to the genetic experiments where they did not want any cross-contamination between experiments. And they used geographical locations, obviously, to separate them so they would not come together. But they've always divided us. And of course, they're constantly at almost not war, but conflict with each other with these experiments. And it's been a major struggle to keep their experiments pure, especially after this pre-Adamite group that once lived on Mars and Tiamat. After the planet exploded, they moved to the moon, and that was their base for a long time. And then they were attacked again and had to come down to Earth, and that was about 60,000 years ago, and they really started to mess up a lot of the genetic experiments that were going on. They went crazy, making chimera, mixing humans with animals, their DNA with humans, all of it. Now, the long-term program, all of the ETs out there were once experiments. They started off very raw and rudimentary. Their genetics were enhanced. Their consciousness was enhanced, and to a point to where they became self-managing. Now, most of these groups determine when they need a genetic upgrade, when they need a change in consciousness. And they become, one of the steps is that you become a interstellar species.
Okay. So what is remote viewing? Remote viewing's been, I guess, we've been remote viewing for ever since the species has been on the planet. We've had shaman that would do techniques that were basically the same as remote viewing. When does the history of remote viewing begin with you?
When the first man walked the planet.
Right.
And animals remote view, most animals anyway, remote view naturally anyway.
Right.
If you ever had a dog or a cat or work with them or see a natural disaster about to happen and see all the animals walking up the hill and stopping right at the place where they should stop and nothing happens to them, like in the tsunami in Phuket, it's a natural ability.